Welcome to the latest episode of Getting to Know Jew from the Kansas City Jewish Chronicle. I'm Lonny Goldsmith, your host this week, and I'm incredibly excited to talk to Joel Goldberg, who is in his 15th year as part of the Kansas City Royals broadcast team. He is also an author, podcast host, and a keynote speaker on areas of leadership, among other things. Joel, welcome to the show.
Good to be with you, Lonny. Thanks for having me.
As we're talking, you are currently in Anaheim, California, or just outside of Anaheim. The Royals are finishing up a long West Coast road trip. You do have your son with you, which is nice, but these road trips, like as somebody who's done this for a long time, does it get old? Does it wear on you after a bit?
Yes and no. I mean, I have a new perspective on it in the sense that we did not, as a broadcast crew, we did not travel during the pandemic. I guess technically we're still in the pandemic. I don't know anymore. But for the 2020 and 2021 seasons, we didn't travel. And so it really kind of, I don't know, for better or worse, all of the above, changed my perspective on things. I mean, I think that all of us that do what we do, maybe not everybody, we appreciated our time at home. I shouldn't speak for everybody, but I think we all went through different thought processes with this. I'm going deep right away out of the gate, but we were all home with our families, which I think everybody can understand and went through from a work standpoint. But for a job where you travel essentially every other week for 26 weeks, 13 out of 26 weeks, we are not used to being home for a full 52 weeks. We are not used to being around our families that much, and the same for our families. And so when I say for better or worse, any of us that have been in this business a long time, and I've been on TV 28 years, I've been traveling for full baseball seasons for 15 years. If we've made it that far, it's because if we've made it that far and our families are still intact, it's because there's a understanding and a feel to the rhythm of that. And that all changed. And so Lonny, I wasn't nervous about getting back on the road this year. I was excited about being able to get back to doing my job the way that it was intended to be done. But I had a little bit of trepidation about just what will this look and feel like 2 years after having been home. And for the most part, it was like getting back on the bike and being able to ride. But I think just a different perspective now on things. And I guess that's the best way to describe it. And I think everybody's going through some form of that right now. We're happy to be back to doing what I think we're meant to do. But there's that small piece too that's like, boy, it would be nice to be home as well. So, I mean, and you can't feel sorry for us. I mean, we're traveling and doing baseball and staying in great hotels and on and on and on.
So when you were in those last two seasons where you weren't traveling with the team, were you in the crew working in a studio? Did you all have setups at home? Because I know that various networks and various broadcasters at every level really were doing it in very different ways.
Yeah, our setup, which I think that's probably right. I think every market had a little bit of a different setup, in part because we don't have a quote unquote studio in Kansas City, really because the only property that a regional sports network would have in Kansas City is baseball, because there's no NHL, there's no NBA. So if you look at where you're at in Minnesota, take football out for anyone that's, listening that is interested in this kind of thing. Take football out of it, because every single NFL game is televised nationally. There is no local broadcast once you get past the preseason. The preseason will usually farm out to, a partnership they have with a local network, local affiliate. But once you get to, the regular season, football, every game is national. Now, whether it's seen by a small percentage of the country or a large percentage of the country, it's all national. So the regional sports networks, when a game is not nationally televised, typically have MLB, NBA, NHL. Well, in Minneapolis, you've got three teams there, not to mention, a lot of the college stuff too. And so they've got big staffs, they've got studios and all that. If all we have is baseball, there's really no reason for them to have a studio. So we were doing everything even to this point, and it's one of the beauties of my job and the truly unique aspect of my job is that because we don't have other sports in terms of television, I just do everything in terms of our pregame show. I host our pregame, our postgame. I do all the in-game reporting. If you go up to Minneapolis, they might rotate some people in because this person's on vacation, basketball's off, they're filling in for baseball, on and on. Well, they just have me. So, we don't have the studio. And so what I was doing every single day when the team was on the road, including the rest of our broadcast team, is we would go into Kauffman Stadium. And let's say that there was a 7:00 game at Target Field in Minnesota. For 7:00 game at Target Field or Kauffman Stadium, I'm showing up at 3:30, maybe 4 on the road when batting practice is later for the visiting team. But here it was like, okay. And then, by the way, when you show up that early, there is a lot of hurry up and wait type of stuff. But for the most part, you're just talking with players most of it off camera. You're just learning stories, information. You're finding anecdotes. You're just picking the brain of guys and just BSing essentially. Well, when they're at a distance and they're in Minneapolis and I'm in Kansas City, you can't do that. You can maybe schedule a Zoom or maybe text a guy, but you don't want to wear them out every single day. So instead of showing up at 3:30, 4 o'clock for a road game, I'm showing up at Kauffman Stadium at 5:45 to get on the air at 6:30, having done all my work at home, having done all my prep work, having listened to the manager's daily press conference, jumping in and asking questions on a Zoom call. So there was no connectivity at all. We pulled it off. We found a way to make it work. And it was like I could show up at work at 5:45, even 6 o'clock, be on the air for a pregame at 6:30, finish up a game at 10 o'clock, 10:30, and be home in bed at 11. So it was easy. At the same time, it was really hard, if that makes sense.
Oh, for sure. And you're not doing obviously, when you're not traveling with the team, you're not doing any of that kind of in-game reporting where they throw it to you and you have an anecdote over something that somebody told you, or do they?
No, I still was, but I would say that the best of the best stories were really few and far between. And oftentimes, and I'm thankful that my producer understood this, but oftentimes, because they still, they go to me for in-game reports, typically 2 to 3 times a game. Sometimes on a light night, it might be one, but I always do a first report in the second inning, top of the second or bottom of the second, depending on, is it on our pitcher? Is it on one of our hitters? Can you time it? I mean, there's a rhythm to all of this. Like if I want to do a story on one of our position players that might be batting second, well, he's going to bat in the first inning, not the second. So we're probably more likely to do that report while he's in the field, where we know where he's going to be versus sitting in the dugout. If it's the DH, then you got to sort of map this stuff out and think along with the producer of where it's going to fit. So oftentimes that first report for me during the pandemic was just going back and listening to the post-game press conference of the starting pitcher the last time he pitched 5 days ago and pulling some stuff from there and saying, okay, this is what was on his mind, or this is what the manager said earlier today, or whatever. There wasn't a whole lot of deep investigative reporting. I think it was put best by Jason Benetti, who's the play-by-play guy of the White Sox, who's a friend, and I had him on my podcast recently. He essentially said it was almost like every single announcer, and he was talking about the play-by-play guys, but I'll put myself in there for this discussion, that we were almost all robots because we all had the same stuff. We all had the same stories. We all had the same information. So from that standpoint, while it was easy, it was painful to be in that position. They would go to me for that hit in the second inning. But here's a little, behind the scenes inside baseball, if you want to call it that, is that they would have me set up in an auxiliary broadcast booth at Kauffman Stadium that would be usually used by, say, the visiting team. My partner and I would be in there, and some of our crew. Well, it was crowded in there, and you're just sitting on a stool watching a game. So I would go upstairs, one floor to the luxury suites. I would ask security to unlock those. I would turn on the TV. I'd bring up whatever I was eating for dinner. I'd kick off my shoes. I sometimes might be in shorts and a dress shirt, and I'd be kicking back, watching the game. And then they'd say, "All right, come, we need you for the bottom of the second." So I'd walk down a flight of stairs, oftentimes no shoes on, and sometimes still in shorts. And I'd sit down on a stool in front of the camera. I'd do a report with a Valley Sports backdrop behind me, and then I'd walk back upstairs and continue eating my dinner and watching the game on TV. And that's kind of what it was.
And I haven't covered much baseball. I did in an early part of my career get to cover Gabe Kapler's debut for the Detroit Tigers back in 1999, and went down to Toledo to talk to him. He got called up a couple weeks later. And so I was at his home opener, and you talk about that time in batting practice. And as a reporter, getting to stand behind the cage and talking with, Alan Trammell was there, the GM at the time was there, and just to sort of get to schmooze with them a little bit, to get a good story, to get a good anecdote, to talk sort of the mechanics of watching a player in that kind of pregame mode. I mean, first of all, as a Tigers fan, just one of the greatest, sports geek moments ever for me. But for you, it's like such a crucial part of your day-to-day job to be able to have even like what might seem like banal interaction just goes so far into helping you tell that really cool story in the second.
That's exactly right. And and then sometimes too, it's just like last night, I'm standing in the visiting dugout at Angel Stadium, and this is a cool little thing. I ended up not telling it. Our play-by-play guy did, but I would have gone there if he didn't. But we're standing there, and Noah Syndergaard was going to be pitching for the Angels, and we look out, and the Angels are taking batting practice, and it looks like Syndergaard is actually taking batting practice, which makes no sense because he's not hitting. It's not the National League. The National League doesn't have a DH anymore anyways. And so I'm sitting there thinking, what is he doing? And I wasn't the only one thinking it. One of our star players, young kid, Bobby Witt Jr., who's will be one of the rising stars in baseball, was out there watching. And he turns over and he says, and I'm standing there, our general manager standing there, he goes, what is Syndergaard doing hitting? And we all couldn't figure it out. And then our GM said, but he was taking ground balls at third base before too. Well, I mentioned this to one of the Angels announcers, which, by the way, that's one of the biggest things that all of us will attest to missing is the interaction with the other team's announcers, because we're friends with all of them. I don't necessarily keep in touch with them. Some I do, but we exchange ideas and stories and catch up and all that. And so we lost the face-to-face of that. So anyway, Mark Gubicza, who's a friend and former pitcher and now longtime announcer for the Angels, but in the Royals Hall of Fame, he walks over to say hi to all of us. And I said, hey, what's the deal with Syndergaard hitting too? And he just started laughing. He goes, no, that's a kid named, I don't even remember the guy's first name. His last name's McKinnon. We just called him up on Saturday, but we've been doing stories on our broadcast about how he and Syndergaard look like twins. And they even, like on Sunday, I think they had even sat next to each other in the dugout just to mess with the cameras because they look exactly the same. So you miss that stuff when it's happening in the dugout. You have zero chance of getting that when you're not there in person. Not to guarantee that you get that every day when you are in person, but there's zero chance you get it if you're not. That right there, in a nutshell, is what we missed the last couple of years and why we all had the same thing. And so you get these little bits and pieces. And also the other thing too, Lonny, is I don't necessarily go into every day with a plan of what I want to get. I have ideas, but I've done this long enough to understand that most of them don't pan out, whether it's because there's nothing there or you just don't end up with the time with someone that you were hoping to get the time with. And so I kind of go in with the thought of, any one of these guys that I walk by or talk to or say, hey, might have something interesting for the day. Now, it's not as simple as saying, hey, you got anything? But you just start talking with people. You just start having conversations. And once you do, things pop up and, oh, really? You did that? Oh, wow. Oh, well, what are your parents doing here? Oh, that's really cool. Well, what, and it just leads to, I got all this family here because my dad actually grew up in Cleveland and, and so my uncle and aunt and all my cousins are coming to the game and never seen me. Oh, okay. We got a story here. It's hard to do that when you don't see people face to face.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think it's such a fun insight into your job. And similarly, like I'll be talking to people who are like, oh, can you give me a list of questions ahead of time? I just don't want to give like dumb answers. Right. And I'll be like, well, I could, but I don't I sort of have an outline in my head, but I'm not the kind of person who scripts a lot of my questions simply because I want the banter. I want the back and forth. And it's way more interesting to me that way. And you get, I think, a little more authenticity out of the person you're talking to when you have a conversation that way.
100%. And I'll say this is a topic I love. And so you and I align with this. I don't know that there's a right answer, because if you are someone that needs to be, for lack of a better term, more structured, I would hesitate. Well, I'm not a structured person. I could follow structure, but I need to be able to kind of freewheel it a little bit. And I would suggest, and I think it sounds like it's the same for you, that I'm at my best when I can respond and react instead of following a list. But I also have met so many reporters, personalities over the years that are at their best when they are following that list. And to get away from that, I would argue that the banter that you're talking about is better, but it's only better if it works for you. And so, that's something that I think, like we hear it in baseball all the time, play to your strengths. You hear it in all sports. Well, you got to play to your strengths. And so I understand. Yeah, for me, like I'll out myself here. Had you sent me a list of questions, I would have started to look over it. And as soon as I could see that there was nothing weird or concerning, like, oh yeah, this guy knows his stuff, I wouldn't have read them all. I'd be like, it's fine. I don't want to overthink that. I don't think. And so, like, even on my podcast, I will give people a heads up on 3 questions. They're and it's more of a business leadership podcast, but it's I'll ask them, what's the biggest home run you've hit? What's the biggest swing and miss you've taken? And what is small ball to you? What are the little things in your world that add up to the big results? The only reason why I give them that question is what I found was that if I was pre-planning those questions, they should at least have the right to pre-plan those answers. And it was catching people off guard. But otherwise, I just tell people, we're going to talk about you, what you do, and everything's going to be in your wheelhouse. So let's have that banter and go back and forth. It's just a more natural conversation. It may not be as polished in terms of like this perfectly wrapped,
sure,
fits in it. But I think it's just more real.
So you mentioned the podcast a couple of times. Let's talk a little bit about that. How did you get started doing that? And is it sort of is it an off-season project for you? Is it a year-round situation? How did it come together?
So it's a year-round. There are moments where I'm like, maybe this will be better if it were, not during baseball season. But I've been lucky enough to build a little bit of a team. It all started somewhat accidentally, and I'm going to try to give you the short version if there's such a thing on this. But I work 6 months a year. Now, I always tell people that I'm working essentially 7 days a week for 6 months a year. And so it all evens out in the end. But I was often bored in the off season and would pick up some small things, college basketball, college hockey, a lot of minor league hockey. So just some little things. And at one point, about over 5 years ago now, I was going to speak to a group, like a little motivational speech for a small association. And a buddy of mine asked what I was up to. And I told him, and he said, you could do that for a living. I said, really? What do you mean? And he goes, you could make a business like just out of speaking, which anyone in the business world gets that because they've either been a speaker, they've listened to speakers and conferences and blah, blah, blah. I don't live in that world. That's just not a world I live in. And most of the time, people like me get asked to speak. It's usually to the Rotary Club, to the church group, to the synagogue, it's community outreach. So you would never, at least in my mind, I would never have equated that to a business, something that you can monetize. But, I was interested having most of my off seasons off, and I started a speaking business. Now, everyone that I met said, if you're going to be a speaker and you're going to be on the circuit, so to speak, you got to write a book. Speakers write books. And I thought, I don't know what the heck I'd write a book about. So I'm going to start a podcast instead because I know how to interview people. I need to figure out some of the logistics, but it would be a great way to meet people out of sports, maybe interview some leaders and CEOs and tell their stories. And it'd be a good way to build content. Maybe that would help me with the book. And sure enough, that's what happened. So I started the podcast in November of 2017 called Rounding the Bases. And it started as an every other week thing. Then it became weekly. Then it became multiple times a week. Then the pandemic hit and I did something crazy, but it all paid off. I decided to do the podcast 5 days a week. Now I wasn't running that on iTunes and all the audio stuff, but I was doing like 2 of them on audio, and all the rest of them, or all of them, I would stream live on Facebook with the thought that everybody's sitting at home right now. Why don't I just, start telling people stories? Maybe I could help them out if their business is suffering. And at that time, a sponsor jumped in and said, "Hey, we'd like to sponsor you," which was huge because I was at that point completely out of work and unemployed because baseball was on hold. And nobody was hiring speakers. Everybody was canceling on any speaking gigs I had. And so the podcast really became my one lifeline. Once baseball came back and everything cleared up, I got back to doing 2 or 3 per week. And so now it's twice a week, which is still a lot, but it's been huge because I can go in now to speaking to an insurance company or medical group or whatever it is, educators, and pull up these clips from the podcast that are really relevant, mix them with some of the baseball stuff. And it's all leadership and life type of discussions.
Why is, that type of leadership speaking? What was it that drew you to that area? I mean, because that feels like a very specific niche to speak to.
I think, again, understanding that I didn't expect it. But once that was suggested to me, because Lonnie, that was like, that to me was one of the biggest challenges. It was like, wait, you think I should run a speaking business and be a motivational speaker? Or what would I even talk about? That was kind of like the same thing with the book. But as I thought about it more, I realized I came to Kansas City in 2008. I'd worked in St. Louis for 10 years before that. I'd left St. Louis a little bit of a similar role. I ended up with more responsibility when I got to Kansas City. But I went from St. Louis, where they won every single year, still do. They're on a bad year, they're maybe in second or third place, knocking on the wild card door. Most years they win the division or they're in the playoffs. And so like every team, your Tigers, my Royals, a lot of your listeners in Minnesota and the Twins, we would all just be happy in the market size we're in. And Detroit's a bigger market, but not like in New York, obviously. I mean, it's like the biggest of the small or the smallest of the big.
Right. I mean, there's a lot of similarities between the Twins and the Royals in a lot of ways.
I think so. And, so I think that for me, I watched going from St. Louis to Kansas City. I saw a team that was a last place team every single year. It was a shock to the system. Like I'm used to seeing a team compete. Now you don't go in my world, you don't go like, I'm going to go here because they win. You go for the best job. And Kansas City, we had a lot of family connections there. And my wife had grown up there when she was younger. My sister-in-law, brother-in-law lived there. So, it was going to be a great fit. But I was not used to the losing. That took a while. There were a lot of lessons learned there. And then I watched them build a championship team. I watched them build a culture. My first day there, their GM, who's now the team president, said, "I want to build a championship culture." He had been there about a year and a half before me, and they were the worst of the worst. And I watched them build a culture that's still there to this day, even during the winning or the losing. And so it dawned on me that I had experiences in terms of culture, leadership, and team building that everyone could potentially be interested in. And no matter what profession you're in, you want good teams. You want a good culture. That's a buzzword, and everybody wants good culture. Well, I had witnessed it. I had a front row seat to it with stories and experiences that weren't really being told on a baseball broadcast, maybe in a 30-second, 1-minute version, but not in an extended version. And so I understood that at that point that I was, I don't know. I was blessed with more content than what most people have. I was blessed with having all of this extra content or an ability to add on to that content that we couldn't do on a broadcast, and that maybe most speakers didn't have. There are other broadcasters out there that do what I do, but for the most part, they don't. And so I felt like, boy, I've got an opportunity here to take people kind of behind the scenes a little bit and do it in a way of, look, here's the thing, like anybody that talks about leadership or culture, their audience has heard it before, or like none of this is groundbreaking. But I have always known that I was a storyteller. I knew that from the time I was a kid. I think it's starting to manifest itself in different ways or off on other tangents and expanding. And that's been, to me, really one of the great revelations for me professionally.
So had you, obviously working, you're in baseball right now. You had been in baseball with the Cardinals previously. Had it been baseball, sports, broadcasting more broadly, journalism, this is sort of an offshoot of journalism. What was sort of your path to get to where you are?
Yeah. So it's all I ever wanted to do. I don't know that I knew exactly how it would turn out. I mean, I certainly didn't know if it would turn out well or not, but I didn't know the path I would go down. I just knew that I wanted to be on TV, and I would have gone the radio route if that presented itself too. But really, TV was where my passion was. I mean, as young as first or second grade, and I say that because I had our first grade teacher. I grew up out east, outside of Philadelphia, before moving to Chicago, and our first grade teacher moved up a grade with us to second. So somewhere first or second grade, I know that teacher, Mrs. Dunwoody, she used to complain to my parents how I would disrupt class with all the recaps of the games the night before. This is what the Phillies did, and this was just like reading out of a box score. If I had gone to sleep or if I remember correctly, at that age, I wasn't allowed to stay up to watch the end of a game, but I certainly got it in the paper when it was on the front driveway the next morning. And so that which is a very unique concept for this day and age, I suppose.
Right.
But
I grew up the same way, so I understand.
Yeah, the last of a generation. And so early on, there was that storytelling and that reporting aspect that maybe I didn't know at the time, but I knew that I loved to be, at 7 or 8 years old, I loved to be the guy to tell everybody and get that reaction. Oh, really? Like, I love to be that person. To this day, I still am. Like, I mean, if you, like, I have no desire to have somebody fly me to Ukraine or somewhere like that. Yet, if someone asked me to go there and report, I'd be there in a heartbeat. Like, there's just something about being in the middle of everything that I love. I would suggest that being in the middle of a baseball season is a lot safer than reporting on war. But there's something about being the one that's always been there for me. So anyway, I went to the University of Wisconsin in Madison and, studied journalism, got out and I got my first job in Rhinelander, Wisconsin. So that's way up in the north woods of Wisconsin. Some of your listeners might know that area, and up close to the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. Really got that job knocking on doors. I mean, I'm applying for jobs in 1994. I got 25 rejections, and I tell all of my audiences now too, from a speaking standpoint, I ask the question, what makes you different? Because whatever you do, there's someone else that does it too. And it's not always a matter of who does it better or worse. Sometimes it's who you know or the connections. And I had no good connections. And so I started driving around the country and knocking on doors and essentially cold calling, which I hate to do, but I suddenly moved to the top of the line. And so if there was a stack of 100 resume tapes, maybe instead of being at the bottom, I moved to the top. And then as soon as the job opened, they called me. So I got in, making no money, but I was on the news for this NBC television affiliate in a small town of 7,800 people. And then I was the cameraman and the producer and the writer and the editor and the reporter and the anchor. And 2 years later, I got back to Madison, NBC affiliate there. And then 2 years after that, to St. Louis, to the Fox affiliate there. Along the way, shifted from news to sports. And then by the time I got to St. Louis, I'm covering multiple Super Bowls and multiple World Series and multiple NHL playoffs. And so doing all that kind of stuff for the news. And then after 6 years, right after covering the Cardinals getting swept by the Red Sox in the 2004 World Series, the regional sports network, Fox Sports Midwest at the time, kind of noticed what I was doing, and they were there covering the World Series, and they had an opening, and they said, we'd love for you to come work for us. And so that was my start of 2005. That was the end of me working for local news stations. And now it's sports full time. And so since 2005, I've pretty much been embedded with, the Cardinals, the Royals, and 100% sports. No breaking, weather or murder or anything that could take a 3-minute sportscast and shorten it to 1 minute. I know what I'm doing every day.
I think that your story of the cold calling is not all that different from a lot of people around our age. And I say we're within a few years of each other, but it's very similar experiences for being a journalist in school in the early to mid 90s, where there was limited to no internet or email, and certainly nothing that could handle no email that could handle the sending of video clips. You were having to send tapes off everywhere, which is an expensive proposition to do. And you had to be willing to work in some small, far-flung places to advance.
And I think that's still true. I mean, I'm always amazed, like when I talk to somebody younger and they ask, the path and how I did it, and I try to put it in terms of, this era, and still getting back to how do you make yourself different? What's different? But I could always tell. It's not that I could tell whether they'll make it or not. I could tell whether they're willing to put in the effort or not. Mm-hmm. And when they say, but you don't really need. No, you. So you can kind of tell, okay, they're not going to be willing to go to that small town. They're not, and every now and then they might catch a break. But I always tell people that are younger, if you're looking to do what I do and you're looking to do that right away, you better have not only the best of connections, but be like at such a higher level than anyone that's coming out of college, almost like a prodigy level. Because the beauty of those small markets is that you can go there, and as long as you don't do something, in terms of a fireable offense, saying something inappropriate on the air or doing something, illegal or whatever it is, those are markets that are built and that are used to seeing you struggle and learn as you're going on. It's like, it's like the minor leagues of baseball. It's where you're supposed to learn, and you're not going to be compensated too well for it. So who wants to sign up for that? But I'll get back to the whole what makes you different. I remember a few years ago, kind of, riffing on this, so to speak, doing my little spiel. And I was talking to my nephew about it, who at the time was in college. And I was telling him how I knocked door to door, blah, blah, blah. I wasn't knocking door to door. I should go back and say I was calling TV stations. And again, you're right, Lonnie, no internet. 1994, email had just been created. If you'll remember, that you could go to the college library and log in. And that was the extent.
That's right. That was it. Right?
And you didn't have laptops or computers. Maybe you'd have a computer. You probably had a word processor. So there was none of that stuff. But, you could get information of all the TV stations. And so I'd call the TV station, and the receptionist would answer, and I'd say, can you tell me the name of your news director? I mean, think about that. I would have to call to ask who to ask for. That information wasn't there. And then they would say, it's Dave Smith. And then I don't know why I just wouldn't say, can you transfer me to him? But I would call back 10 minutes later, as if somehow that would give me a better chance of getting through. I don't know. And I'm pretty sure that I had like a written script in front of me. And it was basically, hi, Mr. Smith. My name is Joel Goldberg. I just graduated from the University of Wisconsin. I'm looking for a job in TV. I understand you don't have an opening right now, but I'm actually passing through town next week or in 2 weeks. Would you be around that Wednesday or Thursday? Because if so, if there's a time, I'd love to come in and just introduce myself and hand deliver a tape to you. And almost every single one of them said yes. And I was never going to those towns until they said yes. And once they said yes, then I went and I drove across the country. And a few of them were 5-minute meetings. Most of them, though, were 20 minutes, 30 minutes, an hour. Hey, let me take you on a tour. Let me introduce you to everybody. Hey, let's sit down and review your tape. So I was already building these relationships, not understanding the value in that. And that's one of the things that I talk to a lot of groups about, not understanding the absolute critical importance of building trust in relationships. I didn't know that then. I just knew that this was my dream. It was the only thing I wanted to do, and nothing else was working. So I was trying something else. But the discussion with my nephew was about this. And he said, yeah, well, nowadays it's easier because we have LinkedIn. I said, so does every other person. So what makes you different?
Yep.
So I would even still say, great, you can send a message now. I get so many messages every day on Instagram and LinkedIn hitting me up for something that the first sentence I just can tell, and I just hit delete because they're just soliciting. So, there's so much noise out there. What makes you different? That to me is the biggest key.
I think that's right. And I think the tools might be better, but you've got to be better at using those tools than anybody else.
That's right.
to make yourself stand out. If you can't, you're just another person cold calling a guy who's on TV a lot.
And I think that that's a great point that you make too about the tools, because I also think, like, we could have the same discussion, let's say, about analytics in baseball. There has been for many years and will continue to be the debate of analytics versus scouting. What do the numbers say? What do the eyes tell you? And, baseball has gone very analytical and very numbers based, just like most professions. But if you can't marry it all together, so like your discussion about, or your point about the tools, you have to be able to use them. You have to be able to use the analytics. If you were going to sit there and say, well, it used to be this way and we could always get it done, but you have to be able to do all of those things, because there's a good chance that your competition or certainly anybody that's younger than you is going to be really good at that stuff. So you have to understand how to do it all. You have to understand the technology. You have to understand the new tools, and there'll continue to be new tools. There always will be. And then you have to figure out how to marry that, to me, with sort of that old school ability to build relationships that many of us in our generation understand.
Absolutely. Well, Joel, I could go on and on, but we're going to let you get back to a little relaxation before you got to head to the stadium in Anaheim. But last question real quick, we love to end on is, what's your favorite part of the Kansas City Jewish community?
I think for me in Kansas City, and not that I know everyone,
sure,
but it's a smaller community. I mean, there are plenty of numbers, right? But it just feels like, at least in Kansas City, it's not that everyone knows everyone, but I'm pretty sure you're one step, at most 2 steps removed from someone. I mean, in theory, there shouldn't be anyone Jewish in Kansas City that they either know my family, or more likely my sister-in-law's family. She's very active, Stacy Belzer, in the Jewish community. It's actually funny when, and she's worked for the Federation and different jobs, JCC, and I think I'm getting all that right. But when I meet someone, I always say, if they say that I'm the Royals guy, then it may not be the Jewish community. But if they say, hey, are you Stacy Belzer's brother-in-law, or are you Rick Belzer's brother-in-law, or hey, I heard you're related to him, like Jewish community. So that's how close, how tight it can be.
Yeah.
I don't want to say close knit, but so I think that's it. Is just that there's sort of that closeness of knowing that there's always someone that'll help you out if you need it, or that you're really only one step removed. I got to leave you with this one. It's one of my winning stories that I love to tell if I'm speaking to a synagogue, or to any Jewish group. Early in my career in St. Louis, I wasn't even married yet. I think my wife and I were engaged, and I'm working at the local Fox affiliate, and I get a phone call. Now, this is back again, very early stages of internet. I mean, so now we're talking like 1998, earlier stages. And so you're just as likely to get a phone call directed to your desk than you were an email, or, certainly no social media. And it's this woman calling, and she says, hi, I'm so blah, 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 whatever the name is. And it was a Jewish name. And she said, we're watching you, and we're proud of you to have you here in town. And we're so excited for you. And it's great to, see you on our TV. And I said, thank you so much. This is so nice of you. And, being newer to town, she said, I'd love to invite you, to dinner on a Friday night. And I said, oh, thank you so much. She said, so we'll be here, and my daughter's going to be here, and blah, blah, blah. And I said, okay, let me just check with my fiance. And it just went completely silent.
Oh, that's awesome. So
I killed the conversation so quickly. So it was not a match, so to speak.
Well, so no home cooked dinner for you that night.
There was not a home cooked dinner, and if I hadn't mentioned Susan, I would have at least had a free dinner out of it. But it was a package deal, and they were not looking for the full package.
Well, that's their loss, clearly. Well, Joel Goldberg, thank you so much. Best of luck to you and the Royals and the rest of this season. The Getting to Know Jew podcast is a product of the Kansas City Jewish Chronicle and the Jewish Federation of Greater Kansas City. It is part of the Jewfolk Podcast Network and produced by Jewfolk Inc. Please rate, review, subscribe, and share. If you have suggestions for future guests, please email the show at webmaster@jewishkc.org.